from tomorrow, Robert Mueller, he will testify before Congress on live and living television. Now, since the vast majority of the American public, including, I should say, I think the vast majority of members of Congress haven't even read the Mueller report, most people will be learning quite a bit about the president's actions. Now, we know that Mueller punted any decisions on obstruction of justice to Congress, but in the report, he clearly spelled out multiple instances of possible obstruction. Now, that caused more than 1,000 former federal prosecutors from both political parties and multiple administrations to sign a letter saying Donald Trump would be facing charges if, in fact, he were not president. My next guest, one of them. He also penned a piece in The Atlantic called Trump's Defiance of the Rule of Law. And I'm going to read a portion of that for you now. Quote, "No prior administration has pushed the envelope of the law to deflect outside scrutiny to the same degree as this one. In a recent letter from the White House to the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, the president, in effect, rejected the entire notion of congressional oversight as illegitimately political. The president has publicly declared his intent to resist all congressional inquiries through a variety of means. By one count, he's currently defying as many as 20 different efforts to examine his conduct." Paul Rosenzweig, he joins us now. He is senior fellow at the R Street Institute, and he was senior counsel on Ken Starr's team that investigated President Clinton back in the 1990s. Paul, thank you for the time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
You know, Paul, maybe it's an odd place to start, but I got 3 teenage kids, so I'm going through a lot of civic stuff with them as it relates to their coursework. And one of the questions that came up on a late night was the very premise of separation of powers or checks and balances. I gotta tell you, it's a hard argument to convince that the current system maybe wasn't designed for a Donald Trump, but certainly you ask, where is the equality of the legislative branch? Where is, even when the judicial branch weighs in, the acknowledgement of the rulings as it comes to the executive? I really don't think it's an exaggeration to wonder if the founding fathers ever intended for there to be such a top-heavy executive branch, all but daring the other two to actually do something about it.
Well, I think that that's a great historical perspective to begin with. In fact, the founders had the exact opposite presumption. They put the legislative branch in Article 1 of the Constitution because they thought that it would be the locus of most of the power and that the executive would be, I would say, somewhat more ministerial than what we've come to experience. They were confident that if we ever had an aberration of the sort that we're having now, that Congress would react so swiftly in removing the executive from office that it really wasn't a question for them.
But Paul, do you think, again, that those founding fathers assumed that, well, wait a minute, there'd be a thing called shame on the part of a president, that he or she would look at the office as more than just he or herself, and that they'd basically adhere to the rulings from the courts here or decisions or subpoenas from the legislative branch? Or would they say, where the hell's the spine, Congress? We've given you these enumerated powers here. You've made decisions. You're not following through just because somebody's calling your bluff. Would they be more mad at Congress, or would they be more disappointed in the president?
I honestly think they'd probably be more disappointed in Congress. Congress has systematically given up its authority, has delegated more and more opportunity to the executive branch to be a leader, so much so that, Arthur Schlesinger wrote a book about 30 years ago entitled The Imperial Presidency, which was all about the aggrandizement of power in the executive branch and away from the legislative. So this Congress is just the end result of a long-term atrophy, if you will, of congressional power that would surprise and shock the founders.
You know, we just had on Mimi Rocco, one of the folks who also signed that same letter. In addition, we've spoken to many others of the 1,000+ former federal prosecutors, others who've put their name to it. Honestly, Paul, I thought that document, given the run of various administrations, crossing political parties, ideologies, etc., would have had more of a thunderclap than it did on the Hill. I honestly was shocked because I thought that would almost give cover to both political parties to say, enough, let's now do something. We can debate what that something is, but somehow it fell into the ether with so many other things that you thought would be the penultimate thing that would finally get some action. Are you surprised at where we are, at least politically related to the common good?
Pretty surprised. I mean, you have to remember that one of the reasons that the Mueller report seems to have had less impact than I think it ought to have is that the way this played out, the administration and in particular the Attorney General were able to front run the report with their own summary, which in retrospect turns out to be manifestly inaccurate in the way it characterized the Mueller report. So much so, of course, that Mueller himself complained about that to the Attorney General. So in some ways, the rapidity of the news cycle today has allowed us to push uncomfortable facts too far out of our minds and into the past too quickly, so that we no longer have to live with them, really.
You know, Paul, I mentioned before, among your many bona fides, you were, in fact, the senior counsel for Ken Starr in the Clinton probe. I recently heard, I want to share a bite here from Ken Starr, and we remember where the germination of what turned out to be, obviously, the foci of Lewinsky, but where that probe first started and where it ended. I want to play what he's saying now, Ken Starr, and get your reaction for the man you worked with as to seemingly the different standards for then and now.
The mandate that Bob Mueller received has some broad language, including related to type language, which tends to open the door. But there are checks and balances. We do not want investigators and prosecutors out on a fishing expedition. If the investigation goes beyond the Russian mandate, and let's just say, well, let's just look into the financing of Trump Tower, but there's no Russian connection to it, then the argument is there, as I see it, right, that the investigation has gone too far.
Paul, you know, I think I don't care anyone's political baggage they bring to the table to say, stay in your lane here, Bob Mueller, which to many critics, he stayed maybe even a too confined lane versus to where the Starr report went. There does seem to be a major shifting standard for then and now. Isn't that a fair representation of where we are now versus where Starr said he should have gone then?
Well, Ken's an old friend, and I love him dearly. I don't think that it is fair to say that Mueller went out of his lane. So I guess I disagree with the factual premise. Mueller's report was about the Russian connections of the Trump campaign and about obstruction of justice of the investigation of those Russian connections. So that clearly falls within the related to jurisdiction and actually tells us, as you said, that Mueller read his charge very narrowly, perhaps too narrowly, but he certainly never took it out beyond the bounds of what he was assigned to do. And so I think he probably answered Judge Starr's worries pretty decisively.
Where do you think we're going to go from here, Paul? We're going to hear in a week from tomorrow. Mueller's going to come, you know, before Congress and before the American public. It'll play itself out. I don't expect him to be revelatory beyond what was in the actual pages of the document. I'm sure some will take political shots at a guy with a lifetime of national service to this country. But he'll basically be just the facts, ma'am, Joe Friday. Where does it go from there? Do you think impeachment is warranted? There's increasing pressures on Pelosi to bring an impeachment inquiry. What would you do if you were a member of Congress?
Well, to the ultimate question of where we're going to go next, ask me after the Mueller testimony. There's a world of difference, I think, between reading a book and seeing a movie. And so this is going to be the difference between reading the cold text of the Mueller report and seeing it enacted by the author in a public sphere. So I think that there is at least a possibility that the testimony will actually drive a changed political environment. As for what I think should happen or what I would do if I were a congressman, I think that there is ample evidence to open up an impeachment inquiry. I wouldn't prejudge the result of that inquiry. I think Congress owes it to itself and to the American public to conduct an independent investigation, not just rely on what Mueller has told them and then reach its own judgment. But I think what Mueller has said is more than enough to start the ball rolling.
Paul, thank you so much for your time. Been a pleasure to talk to you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
When we come back, Democrats in Congress, they haven't been able to get their hands as much as they want them on President Trump's federal tax returns, but they may have just gotten a big assist from the state of New York. We'll be joined by a writer from the New York Times who covered this to explain after this break.